Myrtille was the ideal PhD student because you never saw her. And I don't mean that in a negative sense at all, but because she was passionate about her work and you knew she was out there doing those investigations and just needed a little bit of guidance here and there, but essentially this is really all her own work, so that's great. Over to you, Myrtille.
Thank you, Ken, for making it again today, and thanks to Maxime and Marit for inviting me to your seminar series. So Ken already gave you a bit of a summary, and really in 30 minutes I can only hope to give you a flavor of what the last 3+ years were about. Important, really, it was about assessing regional diversity in the wheatbelt and finding out if the discipline of comparative agriculture was relevant, was good to do that. So why regional diversity of farming systems? Because it's a tool to explain what is it that farmers are doing. And you all know that there's plenty of applications when we understand what they're doing and why this way, not another. But it's notoriously difficult to do because there's not two farms the same. There's so many things that can potentially matter, and it's just difficult to capture enough farming information. It takes resources. And as I mentioned, and Ken did, I'm going to do that using a discipline that is novel to Australia. That's got its own framework, the concept around the concept of agrarian system, and its own methods, which are gathered under a procedure called the agrarian diagnosis. So there's a lot that could be told, that could be said about it. But the main things is that comparative agriculture is an integrative, holistic approach. So it uses multidisciplinary concepts, and as Ken said, mixed methods. It also captures a lot of information about nearly everything that can potentially matter to explain farming systems. So that means human aspects, but it does remain focused on agronomy, so very pragmatic things. And there is almost no peer-reviewed literature, at least in English. French haven't been very good at speaking English. And there has been no example in Australia of studies of using comparative agriculture, and generally very little in broadacre agriculture. So a little bit in the US, but not much. So my research question for my PhD is, well, is comparative agriculture relevant to farming system research in Australia? And the question is worth asking, because when I started to talk about this, it was very much, oh, it's integrative, it's holistic, it's got all those great things about it, and really people were telling me, that sounds nebulous, Myrtille. And when I was saying, you know, it uses qualitative methods, qualitative? Is that even science? At least in agronomy, that is very much the attitude. But my new hypothesis is that, yes, it could be useful. Because, once again, regional diversity is a good way to look at farming systems. I will demonstrate that. And simply because of its ability to capture lots of farm information. And it's not only me saying this. There is increasing recognition that this kind of approaches are needed to understand complex real-world problems in society. So I'm going to demonstrate that comparative agriculture, you know, is useful. First, by demonstrating its methodological relevance with a review, and then its capabilities with an application here in the wheatbelt. So first, the review. Is there any precedent to comparative agriculture or similar methods and concepts? So I did a very broad scope review of the methods that are used to study agricultural systems here in Australia. And to do that, I looked in detail at 92 publications that represented, that covered a wide range of disciplines and approaches that can potentially be relevant to study agricultural systems. I listed all the methods used and categorized them to build a network map. So here it is. So essentially, we have 11 methodological families. So within each, there's like, you know, list of methods. The nodes are their relative importance in the literature, so are they like, you know, core methods or just like accessory things? In blue, we have the quantitative, and in yellow, the qualitative approaches. And the linkages, so that's, for instance, you've got one publication using 3 types of methods, so those 3 will have 3 links. This kind of representation is useful to demonstrate the prominence and the linkages of methods. So for instance, in Australia, lots of mathematical programming, and so that's MIDAS, for instance, system modeling with APSIM, and a lot of statistics, obviously. back to farming diversity, the result here is that really it's not much addressed. The farms are not really segregated. There's not many approaches to segregate farms within regions. And when it's done, it's only with quantitative methods using classes that segregate a population or using multivariates, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. Didn't find any example of comparative agriculture, and in fact, very, very rare methodological similarities. There were a couple over there in the qualitative methods with very, very few papers looking at using explorative methods, and others like investigative, where there's slight differences. But also, even related frameworks which have a lot of connection with comparative agriculture, such as social ecological systems or evolutionary economic geography. It was just not used very much. It exists, but it's not used much. As for mixed methods, not many publications were reporting the joint use of qualitative and quantitative methods. And even here, you can see this kind of a divide, like all the qualitative are on the periphery. It's not like a mixture of qual and quantitative. So potentially, comparative agriculture could build a bridge. So methodological relevance, I think that that's demonstrated. And there's a conceptual relevance as well. And what about the concrete relevance, as in like, pragmatically, besides the theory, what can we do with it? So I tested the capabilities of the methods here in the center of the wheatbelt, where a lot of other studies have been done before, so hopefully a lot of relevance for models and other things. And for, I suppose, we have visitors here who don't really know about the system, so very large farms, 1,000, 10,000 hectares, crop dominant, but also a lot of mixed farming, Mediterranean type of climates. And the region was about 4,000 kilometers square. Same for visitors. This is what the equipment looks like. Very, very big machine, very mechanized. And this is the type of landscape that we're working with. Very open. So, assessing regional farm diversity, so the diversity of farming system within this region. What does it mean here? Because it can mean different things. Here it means building a typology of production systems based on observations and evidence. And I emphasize building, it's a process, and production system. I'm not looking at farmer profile as in their attitude toward risk or their perceptions. So that means grouping farms which are relatively similar according to their structure, so what farmers have in terms of resources, and in terms of functioning. So what they're doing and how they use those resources. We identify the criteria to best define this group. We compare those group of farms to check if they do have different resources and practices. And eventually, of course, the end game is to see if that explains anything in differences in performances, for instance.
Are you doing this at the whole farm level or at the level?
It's at the whole farm level, but actually it's it's multi-scale. So there is a landscape, farm level and paddock level approach as well. That's important to mention. So, well, the procedure, what it's about. So, mixed method, the agrarian diagnosis. It starts with 1 month of observation. So, essentially being based in the wheatbelt, doing a landscape analysis by driving around, comparing published material with direct observation to first to gather the first clues and to define relatively homogeneous agroecological zones. Then there is a historical investigation. Took me about a month here. It's mostly based on interviews with retired farmers. So not the farmers who are currently farming and who, that comes after, but the people who have seen the changes in agriculture. So that essentially they can give you clues about the factors of recent change and where things have been going, so the trajectories, as Ken mentioned. And importantly, that allows to define interview guidelines without having to interview your actual sample. And then is the actual data collection, data collection with the current farmers, during which the farming systems are investigated in more detail. So their resources, their practices, and eventually all of this being used to define the criteria of the typology of farming systems. So here that lasted 2 months, 35 interviews representing 36 businesses. Finally, so we have the criteria and we have the typology built of production systems. And importantly, we present those results back to the farmers, first for ethical reasons, you know, they spend their time with you, so you need to give something back. But also because if you got something wrong, they're going to tell you. For those interested in the details, always face-to-face interviews, one-on-one, semi-structured, all of this to avoid a number of biases. Respondents were identified by snowballing and driving, so no reliance on existing listing or like, you know, no consultant database or anything. Selection, first randoms and stratified by landscape zones. And recruitment is called calling, which is a fancy way to say that you walk to the farm and you knock on the door. And so as I mentioned, those things are important because they allow to cater for a variety of biases that are usually overlooked in surveys, although this is not a survey. And as you can see, it's quite successful in terms of response rates. Forgot to mention, I interviewed about half the farmers in the area, but I didn't need to. That was only because I needed the stats, essentially. Like after a dozen farmers, you kind of already have your typology. So what's important in those methods is that essentially it's an iterative prioritization, which means that we are able to consider a wide range of criteria, that nothing is predetermined. So you don't do a literature review to find out that other people have decided this is what matters. You go, you consider everything, and that you know potentially matter in the farming system as well. And depending on what appears more important, you investigate further. Few respondents compared to a lot of studies about farmers' practices, but there is no box ticking. Like the format of the interviews allow to gather very good quality data, essentially. And that's important. So few respondents, but very good control over the data. So what is that data? What was collected? 60 variables and a lot of qualitative information to triangulate that information, making sure it's right, across a variety of things, ranging from farm size, organization of those resources, production. So essentially, that's the only way. For the economist, I know that you're probably disappointed, but this is the only way I looked at performance in this particular study. Through yield, production, management strategies, and a bit of social circumstances, because that impacts the availability of labor, which is a production resource. And all of this used to determine criteria and the typology of production systems, according to, once again, structure and functioning. Importantly, then, this has nothing to do with arbitrary classes. So we are not cutting the farming population in like, different classes, which anyway is a very poor predictor of anything. And those are not statistical clusters. So you probably have heard of multivariate cluster analysis, where you plug all the variables and statistical maximization, etc. I did that. It performed less well than the result I will present you, as in the groups of farms were less distinct. So those famed criteria, well, not surprisingly, farm size matter. 3 groups that I called, for lack of a better word, standard, because small really doesn't apply in Australia, large and huge. And importantly, those groups are not just defined by the farm size and the cropped area, but by a number of variables that included labor and machinery capacity, so essentially how wide your machinery is. And when you look at all those variables independently, it's not that obvious that you have 3 groups. But just with a simple index, it appears a lot more that actually what we have here is not one farming population, but 3. So it's a multimodal population distribution. The other criteria is farm type. So same again, that's something that is usually used when we talk about farms. But the definition is precise. It's the presence or not of pastures in rotation. So it's not because you've got a few hundred sheep that you're a mixed farmer. And it's not because the majority of your income comes from grain that you are a specialist cropper either. So either you are a mixed farmer or you 100% crop. And that leads us to 6 farm groups. I found this was the best way to represent them. So here there are individual farms plotted against arable area and machinery capacity. In here, that's the average of the size of the harvester and the size of the seeder, essentially. It's just a way to look at it. And all 6 groups across the 2 types of farms. The shades are like kind of like the range of existence. Of course, the huge farmers is clearly, I mean, it's difficult to define a range of existence with only 1 farm, but that's where the qualitative information help, because you ask questions such as, how much more could you crop, or how little could you be, smaller could you be to survive, or before you start to downgrade your equipment. And the thing is that those groups, well, they had lots of different things about them. So, for instance, the smallest of the mixed farmers, they were the people with the most diverse enterprise mix, and that's not only because they have pasture. They were the people who finished seeding the quickest. They retained the stubbles the least, and that's not only because of grazing, by the way. And they employed no casuals for harvest or seeding. And like that, I've got 30 variables that are significant at least at 5% level, with only 34 data points across agronomy, economics, variable representing long-term strategies, and even social circumstances. So, for instance, those big farms here. So here, they were not included in the stats, by the way, because only 2 people. But those farmers had by far the fastest machinery renewal, turnover of machinery, simply because essentially they've got the financial capacity to take advantage of the taxes reduction when you trade in your machinery and etc. But also the manager was not the operator, which is very different from everybody else. Other examples, the smallest specialist croppers here, they were mostly located on the sand plains, and they mostly had second-hand machinery. And I could go on. Large croppers are the most diverse of farm assets. They were the ones who were doing the most on-farm storage. They were doing a lot of early sowing compared to the other groups. Those farmers here have different resources, and I will talk about this a little bit more in detail. So as to know if our typology with 6 farming systems actually reflects distinct groups, I think the answer is yes here. So, applications. Well, first of all, it's really easy to use. With this, you can define a typical farm and its range of existence, and then you can plug that into a model, for instance. You can also choose better your case studies. For instance, those farmers over there, they essentially, across everything, they're always involved in a research project. They're the people that we turn to straight away, and they're very eager to participate in research because they've got the time, among other things. Those people are never included in comparison. But the point is that they are not representative of the majority of cases in the wheatbelt. So really, they're not relevant for a case study. However, it's important to realize they are here, because without them, the typology is incomplete. Also important, I don't have them listed here, but all those variables are very clear and very pragmatic. We're not talking about aggregated indicators here, or like incomes which come from like which may be defined in different ways. We're talking about FTEs, unit of fertilizer, enterprise mix. So you can do an indicator with that. Location, so it's very easy to use for research. As for development, the idea is that you can have more impact by finding out who you can target for your research and development programs. Essentially targeting your investment strategies better. When you're trying to increase the adoption of a particular practice, who is already doing it? Who is likely to be able to do it? And who has, there's no point in wasting your time there because they simply can't do it. Or what you need to do is focus on what would allow them to do it. Barriers to adoptions, targeting subgroups, etc. It's also helpful in extension to contribute changing discourses. And I'm going to give you an example later in relation to the mixed farmer and the fact that they have different farm resources. All right, so third and last part, after demonstrating that you can use comparative agriculture to define typical farming systems and identify essentially making sense of the fact that there is not one farm that is the same, but you can find patterns that are useful. Here is a way to use the data to further demonstrate the usefulness of comparative agriculture by linking farming resources, practices, and performances. So once again, to show that comparative agriculture can capture a lot of information, farming information, and use that to establish complex relationships within the farming systems. The question we are asking here specifically is in the very heterogeneous landscape of the wheatbelts, do farmers vary rotation strategies across the landscape? It is worth asking because it's assumed. We all know farmers do different rotations depending on what soils they have, but it's not proven and it's not quantified. So we actually don't know which rotation that is. Most of the data we have, and you probably think of the latest surveys of AREs, it's across very large areas or it's specific fields, but it's not at the farm level. Because we know a lot about physical attributes in the landscape, such as those ones, and we have landscape maps, etc. But we don't know anything about really, we know things, but we don't have them quantified again, about how they vary across that landscape. So to build the typology, collected a lot of variables, as I mentioned, and some of that included information about the landscape zones, so the agroecological zones, if you want, the farm soil composition, which is something that is rarely collected, especially in financial surveys. I had detail about 83 rotations typically implemented by those farmers across their different soils, and I had yield information. So those landscape zones, this is a study area and how it looked like. And to define this, I use all that range of variables. And importantly, that included current management. So it's not only the physical attribute, it's also land use. And those landscape zones, essentially we have undulating sand plains, which are very open and just with a gentle relief. Hilly sand plain with a much more accentuated topography. And valley floors, which people know about usually. And what is important is that even though there are many, many different types of soils, in terms of management, it was useful to only distinguish 3 of them according to their overall texture. So light soil, medium soil, and more heavily textured soil, as far as heavy applies in Western Australia, of course. And the important thing is that the soils were present everywhere, but in different proportion. So obviously, for instance, in the valley floor, they were a lot more heavily textured like clays and etc. And much less in the undulated sand plain, sorry. And once again, that's evaluated. How much? Looking at the rotations now and how they varied across the soil. So we have a look first at the light soils only, and here we have the duration and the composition. And essentially, on the light soils, everybody did kind of the same thing, which was a 3 or 4 year rotation, essentially 2 or 3 years of cereals, followed by a break crop, and then we start again, more or less. It's flexible, but that's what happens, which corresponds to about 60% of cereal here, break crops, and very, very rarely a bit of pasture, very rare. Differences occurred on the other soils, where there was a distinction, especially regarding the specialist croppers, who were essentially putting 1 year more of cereal inside that rotation, so longer rotation, more cereal intensive, if you want. And the mixed farmers, this is where they started to implement pastures. So 3 year rotation, for instance, on heavy soils, cereal, and a year of pasture. All of these very significant using mixed models. So a number of applications that I won't go into detail, but another result was that mixed farmers also had more of other soil types, which were like the rocky soil types, which are difficult to work with cropping machinery. And also they had more non-arable lands. So there was a clear correspondence in here between farm type and the farm soil profile, which is important because when you ask a farmer, so why do you keep sheep, even though obviously it's less profitable than cropping, apparently? Well, they will all tell you, oh, I don't know, I just like sheep, and you know, that's what my dad did. And well, nobody mentioned soil types, but actually there's some very good practical reason for their choices in management here. Looking at yield, so same, there was a correspondence between the type of soil on the farm and the long-term farm wheat yield. And so once again, it's a small difference, but when you have, once again, 2 tons per hectare across very large farms, it matters. The mixed farmers essentially have soil types which tend to be less suitable for crop production. And when you add breadcrops in the models, it becomes very significant, it's a much stronger relationship, showing that, first of all, yes, breadcrops are very important to farm wheat yield. We knew that, but so that shows it again. And for those who do social sciences, I think you will appreciate the R-square here. So identifying resources, here farm soil composition, practices, here rotations and production orientation, as well as performances, here in the using the long-term yields. I think we checked that, and importantly, we linked those factors together to explain the complex relationships. So what's next? If there was another year of funding, if there was a project to be done, or inserted somewhere else, well, there's a lot more to do. I've got loads of data, essentially, and there's a lot more to write about regarding what are some of the drivers that this study identified to explain why farmers do what they're doing this way, not another. So, for instance, I mentioned on-farm grain storage, dry sowing, and other farming system differences. Also useful to assess the value of practices. So for economists, that's important. So for instance, how much herbicides are you saving because you've got sheep? Things like that. And of course, what I would have liked to have the time to do, but there just was time for so much. So this is only a draft. I would need to look into this in much more detail. But essentially, this is a way to evaluate the economic and technical capacity and performance of those farm types. Here with the standard, large, and huge farms, and the bars, depending if it's a cropping or a mixed farmer. Incidentally, you can see there is not much difference, actually. So depending on how much money they make with how much hectare per person, pretty much. And that can be used to identify who is likely to transition from one system to another. And who is particularly vulnerable simply because they don't make enough money to withstand the variability in seasonal conditions. Who is likely to exit the industry and who is likely to grow. That's about it. Because it's a PhD exit seminar, not only do I have to, but I want to thank my supervisors who took a risk, first of all, into backing someone who was doing something that nobody had heard of. And for that alone, I think I'm really grateful. And if I had to pick one thing for everybody, well, Ken, everybody's time poor. We all are. But Ken is always available. And I think that's a rare quality, and he really helped me. Steve was instrumental in me securing excellent working conditions. And essentially, that means freedom. And that's rare. So for that, I am really, really grateful as well. Roger was really good to help me writing. When you try to do a PhD by papers, it's kind of essential. So yeah, he helped me with writing better. And my French supervisor, who used to be a teacher, well, the simple fact that he made it, that was quite amazing. So that's excellent. And of course, GRDC and the Australian government who funded me. I also want to thank all the respondents. There's over 100 hours of interviews there. That's a lot of cup of teas. But I also, because I stayed in the study area for 4 months, the best part of it, I got to learn the basics of hockey with the local team, for instance, and I live behind the post office, and people get to know you, and it was a great experience. It's the third time I do a study like this. I did it in Indonesia as well, and it's always great. And I also want to thank my partner. Some of you know him. He's an agronomist, and he's probably the person who's heard the most about comparative agriculture in the entire southern hemisphere. And of course, I think it's important to mention, not everybody is here to help you. Some people try to actively slow you down. That's about it. Thank you for your attention.